early and often I actually was the odd girl out, literally. This is me, 28 years old. 28 years old in this picture, yep. And so you can imagine I was always finding myself in rooms with career admirals and generals, or here at the Army War College as a 28-year-old talking about national security with men who'd seen combat. I started my career in the Reagan administration when I was 19 years old. I was 21 at the Pentagon during the Cold War, and the seats were man-size. If you think that I'm small in this picture, I weighed 92 pounds when I was working at the Pentagon. And my feet literally did not touch the floor. So not a lot of dignity in that. And not surprisingly, my nickname became Tinkerbell. And I could have been insulted, but you know what? I leaned into it because my fairy dust was data and determination. I couldn't change the way that I looked at all. There was no way to make me bigger. I tried gaining weight, it didn't work. I cut my hair into different hairstyles. I still didn't look older. That's what I tried in this picture, didn't help. But what I learned to do is I learned to do my homework before walking into a room and identifying the number one point that had to be made. I waited until the lull in the conversation, and I made the point that was going to be the one that caused a lot of conversation, because I was bound and determined to own the purple elephant in the room. And when you own the purple elephant in the room, all of a sudden, you're really getting to the underlying problem that you're there to solve. And your goal by the end of that conversation is that people sit back and go, yeah, what she said. Because what I had to do with the little deficit that I had was I had to make what mattered to me matter to other people. And what you need to do is remember that you've got to build relevance for any idea that you're supporting. And you want to surround yourself with smart people. And you want to use data and research, and that research you did in advance is your secret weapon to owning the room, to making what matters to you matter to other people, because if you do that, you can increase your revenue, your visibility, and your results. So when I stepped down as the CEO of a medical research foundation, people asked me, well, sort of, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm entering the third phase of my career. And their question was, especially from my husband, well, what was your first phase? And I actually had to think about it for a second. And I got to thinking that, my first phase was sort of building my credibility, building my credentials, right? I went to grad school, went to undergrad, worked at top tier places like Intel Corporation, the Pentagon, the White House. And sort of phase two was taking that experience and leveraging it to up-level the performance of the organizations that I was in. And so when I look at phase three, what I think about is how can I take the experience that I've had amazing experiences, I've had an unusual career, and how can I take that and help the next generation of leaders? How can I take that and help people who are trying to solve complex problems? Now, a lot of you are saying, well, it's very normal. I've done phase 1, 2, and I'm going to do phase 3 of my career. And it is, because most people stay in an industry and you check the box and you move up the career ladder. Well, I didn't do that. I moved from the White House and the Pentagon to high tech and then to the food and beverage industry and into transportation, working with Toyota. And so instead, what I did is I took the scenic route. And the reason why I mention it is that right now, we have so much going on. We have innovation happening at amazing paces. We have industries like agriculture and biopharma and CPG are all of a sudden integrating into one company. And so a lot of people in this room, you may find that you're going to have to take the scenic route too. Or what you're going to discover is that by taking the scenic route, you may find all sorts of new opportunities that you actually never anticipated. And the group of people in this room and the network you have, those are going to be the people that help you do that. We all thought that we'd come back from COVID, and I know that I did as the CEO of a medical research foundation. I thought, okay, we're going to hit the ground running. We're back in the office. Boom, it's going to be great. Well, it hasn't been. I mean, let's be honest, Texas is doing pretty well, but the rest of the world's not doing as well right now. We've basically had a stall in revenue. People are talking about doing layoffs. We have war in the Ukraine, and we're all a little bit worried about China invading Taiwan, where I used to live. But at the same time, we have amazing advances in biopharma. We have people developing competitive space transportation. And we've got Elon Musk out there talking about colonizing Mars. And so what we know is you've got that push and pull of adversity, and it's always been there. But we have to move forward despite having an ambiguous future. And so what I like to talk about is, how do you get to that big idea? And sometimes, especially when things aren't going great, getting to the big idea, it can be painful. Imagine sitting in a train for hours. And I'm not talking about a fancy train. I'm not sitting in a club seat with really nice seats. Instead, I'm on a regional train, and I've got cracked seats. I have no good food choices. And let me tell you, the bathrooms, less than ideal. And then they dumped me off in Princeton, New Jersey, and I don't know if anybody's been to that train station, but it's not very nice, and I think your only option for food is Dunkin' Donuts. And those bathrooms, not so good either. And a taxi cab is sitting there, and it's taking me to go sit in a conference room at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And my job at that time was to sit and listen to some of the smartest and most brilliant minds in the food and beverage industry argue with some of the most brilliant people in public health. And what they were arguing about is the number one issue at that point in time, which was childhood obesity. And pretty much the companies had a problem, which is that public health and the regulators were laying the blame for obesity on the shoulders of these companies. And they were accusing them of peddling sugar and fat to kids and to families that love to eat. And so the companies were in a bind. And I was contacted and brought in to take over an initiative that was mired in acrimony. Ingenuity, the former CEO of PepsiCo, had stepped forward, and she'd asked 15 of her peers, the CEOs of Coca-Cola, General Mills, Kellogg, to step forward and do some coordinated initiative where they could rectify the problems they were having with some of the biggest brand names in the world. And they not only had to rectify their image in the minds of the consumer, but they had to also do it within the minds of people that were eating their foods. And so they argued. I have never had so much migraine medicine in my life. I had 16 CEOs calling and yelling every night. I'm traipsing up to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I've got the chief scientist of all of these companies, fighting with people from various public health organizations. And so finally, after many months, the CEO of McCormick said, you know what, I have an idea. We do something called the Idea Lab, where we bring in our customers, McCormick the Spice Company, we bring in our customers when they're revisioning new products. Why not, Lisa, you can have it, we'll give it to you. So I take the train back down the Northeast Corridor to Baltimore, and I sit in a room for hours with facilitators at the Idea Lab. And what we're talking about, these are people that have been trained at McKinsey and BCG. They're pretty smart people. They've all got their Harvard MBAs. And they're just like this, trying to figure out how we're going to get these 16 companies that made really different foods. They made bread and cereal and ice cream and drinks. How were we going to come up with something that was going to work for everybody? How are we going to get them all to stop arguing with each other? So we held a meeting. In the first meeting, we've got pieces of paper all over the walls, right? You know how you do. Everybody sits at a table. And we were trying to figure out all the variables and where could we find something that was common, where we could agree that that was the way that we could actually help solve the problem of obesity. We wouldn't solve it completely, but could we help in the process? And the chief scientific officer of the Campbell Soup Company, she was sitting in the corner and she was madly conversing with a renowned epidemiologist. And all of a sudden, they leap up and they yell, "It's all about calories." Now, you would think that was really obvious, but we had looked at all the different levers we could pull to make food healthier. We'd looked at sodium, we looked at sugar, we looked at fat, we looked at a wide variety of things. And what they did is this moment of clarity, they recognized that there was one common denominator in all the food that we consume. it's calories. If you reduce calories, you would reduce sugar and fat. And at that moment, we had the big idea. So we went to Washington and we met with the White House. Michelle Obama had just indicated that she was going to make obesity her #1 platform. And we said, we're going to withdraw 1.5 trillion calories from the American marketplace over 5 years. And as a result, we think we'll see some changes in the obesity levels. And so everybody bought off on it, and we did that. Because you need a big idea. Getting to the big idea is really critical, because that's the only thing that's going to get you to the end state. And I want to step back and think of another point in time in history where the big idea was important. And it was at a place where there was a crisis of confidence. And that was 50 years ago when John F. Kennedy announced that he was going to send a man to the moon. Now, for those of us who are old enough in the room to remember that, your parents waking you up, which I remember my mom and dad waking me up and like sitting me in front of the TV, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't remember watching it. But what Kennedy knew is that he had a crisis of confidence. The Soviet Union was exploring space also. They had just launched Sputnik. Yuri Gagarin had just flown around. He was a cosmonaut, had just flown around and orbited the Earth. And so Kennedy needed to marshal all the support, both material and emotional, from the American people in the scientific community, because what he knew is that the United States couldn't hold on to being a technological superpower unless we figured out how to do the impossible. And we did the impossible because the United States did send the first man to the moon. And so what you've got to understand is each of us, everybody in this room, we can all come up with the big ideas. And you don't have to be the leader of the free world in order to do it. But what you've got to do is you've got to work with people that you may never have worked with before. The food and beverage companies had never worked with public health. When we made a decision to have a press conference to get Risa Lavisa-Mourey, who was the head of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Indra Nooyi on stage together, people stopped talking to Risa. It was that bad. I can't tell you how much these people didn't get along. And what we learned is that we had to acknowledge the good things done by our opponents. And by doing so, we needed to acknowledge it publicly, applaud them publicly, because we all know that carrots work so much better than sticks. And the second thing we did is that we came up with a solution that was not a one-size-fits-all solution. I know right now everybody's watching everything that's going on in Washington, and I've done a lot of bipartisan initiatives. And the number one thing I try to get people to understand, you can't have a one-size-fits-all solution. You can't do something in each of your companies in exactly the same way. You have different manufacturing techniques. You may live in different geographies. You have different things going on. And we all now have learned, for those of us I've been again in biotech and high tech and food and beverage, that you come up with the best idea and you're just bound and determined that every consumer and every patient, they're going to love it. And then they don't. Well, why is that? Because they come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, they have different family history, they have different tastes. People in different places like certain things and people in other places don't. So instead, when you revisit the question, when you're making what matters to you matter to somebody else, don't tell them how to do it, but instead come up with a common goal. We came up with calories. But what we did is we made changes that worked for every single company. And what happened is that we came up with a positive dialogue. We came up with a common language that we used with the public health community. And what we realized is that if we worked together, we could actually solve the problem. And the good news is that so many of those people who were fighting madly in 2009 are all now working together at the Milken Institute, where you've got the food and beverage companies coming together to Milken, going to the Google Food Labs, going to the White House conference on food and nutrition that's taking place in a couple of weeks. And they're no longer enemies, they're partners. They're partners in coming up with a solution together that's going to work for more people. So I've got one more big story to share with you, and I called this story the $10 tuna fish sandwich. So I have a question. How many of you guys would like to take a job where your predecessor had been investigated by the FBI because he put his family on the payroll, and better yet, this was of a government agency, better yet, he had offshore bank accounts. In fact, the FBI came and they looked at the offshore bank account and they go, I'm sorry, Mr. Ambassador, you can't do this. And when they came back, the bank account had doubled. He didn't really listen. So that's the situation I walked into when the President of the United States named me as the US Ambassador and Commissioner General to the World Expo, it used to be known as the World's Fair, in Japan. No one told me this. And actually, it was no public news, but something was going on. And so I was named into this role, and here's what happens. I learned what happens when an organization goes and develops destructive behavior. And I learned what happens when hubris is the guiding light of a leader as opposed to doing what's right for the organization or the people. But here's how I found it out. I couldn't get the State Department to even swear me in for my oath of office. So I went to Kinko's, because there is nothing I won't do to figure out how to get done what I want to do. And I found out that there was a notary public at Kinko's. So I go to Kinko's, and I walk up to the lady, I go, are you a notary? And she goes, yes, I'm a notary. I go, okay, here's the deal. I have to be sworn in as the United States Ambassador. Can you do that? She's like, oh yeah, this is fun. So she goes back into the back room and she finds these little plastic American flags and she puts them out there on the counter. And all of a sudden, all these people that are at the copy machines, they're all looking, they're like, what's going on? She goes, oh, this lady's gonna be an ambassador. So everybody gets around and I do so solemnly swear and uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God. And they're all clapping and it was wonderful. And that night, I'm on stage, CNN, with Colin Powell and Dr. Toyota. I don't know if anybody's here from Toyota, but I was with Dr. Toyota. We signed the first half of a bilateral agreement with Japan. And I'm on my way to the airport the next day, got my title, got the half of it signed. I'm at the airport, and I'm literally putting my foot out on the cab, and the phone rings. Hi, this is the State Department attorney, and I don't know how to tell you this, but no one can pay for your trip. And I said, oh, you mean that trip where I'm signing the second half of a bilateral agreement on behalf of the United States tomorrow? And they go, yeah, that trip. And luckily, my husband was in the car with me, and he goes, well, look, we can't embarrass President Bush. You can't not show up. You got to go. He goes, well, pay for it. We'll figure it out. So I fly to Japan. I signed the agreement. And all of a sudden, I'm in Japan for 2 weeks doing all sorts of work, and I found these $10 tuna fish sandwiches on the Ginza in Tokyo. If anybody goes to Japan and you need to save money, I know where you get tuna fish. And I'm eating $10 tuna fish sandwiches while all the other delegations from 199 other countries, they're drinking the finest whiskey, they're eating at the most amazing restaurants, and I'm figuring out what in the heck I'm gonna do. So I start doing what I always do, and that's ranking and rating what it is that we really had to get done. What was job number one? What was job number two? And then I started a benchmarking process, and I took all the activities that we were doing and I benchmarked them against the best of class people in a lot of different categories. And I came up with a way with my team that we were going to deliver on the vision, but we were going to do so in a way that was actually cost effective. So what we did is that we didn't have the fanciest pavilion. Instead, we made a decision to make it about United States jobs. Because the reality is the whole purpose of World's Fairs, since it got started with the Eiffel Tower, is to create jobs for Americans. And we delivered on our promise by having 19 governors come to Japan, and we signed agreements. Signed agreements for manufacturing agreements for car companies, travel and tourism agreements, CAD/CAM agreements, paint for cars. I know more about paint for cars than I ever wanted to know. And we drove millions of dollars of direct investment into the United States. Those governors all signed Toyota agreements and set up manufacturing sites across the United States employing Americans. And then we were supposed to have a big black tie party for this thing called US National Day. It's what all the other countries did. Well, I couldn't afford it. So we flew in Tommy Lasorda, who was the former manager of the LA Dodgers, and we did it all about hot dogs, beer, and baseball. Because nothing says America more than hot dogs, beer, and baseball. And Ambassador Schieffer, who used to own the Texas Rangers, he was the ambassador to Japan at that time. And he was happy with it. Tommy was happy with it. And so we had this big party, and I invited everybody. We were the only country that invited everybody, but that was my job, right? That was my job. I was supposed to be executing diplomacy on behalf of the United States. And people loved it. Because what we did is we delivered on a vision, we made what mattered to us matter to other people, and we did it under budget. It's the only time a World's Fair has been done by the United States in 175 years under budget and delivered on time. So to execute successfully, you need data to make decisions. Another key to execution we know is setting big goals, right? Or when the 16 food and beverage companies got together, we said we were going to reduce 1.5 trillion calories from the American marketplace. But because of the competition between Pepsi and Coke and General Mills and Kellogg and everybody competing against their top competitors, we ended up reducing 6.4 trillion calories from the marketplace in 3 years as opposed to 5, beating our goal by 400%. 99% of sales during that time period were driven by lower calorie products because we met the consumer where we were at. And we also made sure that 16 competitors could find a way to make money and compete with each other and to live on a common good. And so what I learned through all of these things is you've got to set those big goals. And you've got to set big, hairy, audacious goals. You want everybody who works for you, we want them so motivated to wake up in the morning. You want them excited knowing what their purpose is. But most of all, you want your employees to know the world doesn't happen to them, they happen to it. And that's because what you build, every deliverable you leave, and I learned this from Andy Grove, every deliverable that you leave, it actually demonstrates your impact on the world around you. What women have done here with the upskilling in STEM, every single deliverable, that wonderful woman that was speaking about her life, think of the impact that that's had from the people that started it. Because your legacy is your leadership. It's how you react to success or failure. It's who you lift up along the way. Do you do it with humility? Do you do it with graciousness? Do you do it with generosity? And sure, we all love data because we want to prove to our bosses that we accomplished something. We want to prove that we were able to move and analyze what was going on and measure where we were going, measure where we'd been. But really the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you want to be remembered? I'm getting older. I think about that now. Like, how do I want to be remembered? And that's really the question for all of us. Because at the end of the day, people talk about you. They remember you. And so what you want to do is you want to think big. You want to help other people. You want to create a bold vision of the end state. Most importantly, you want to find people's pain points, like this woman's pain point that we watched, and come up with a solution that meets her need. And we're going to embrace data and process because that's the only way we can measure what we're doing. But we're going to make success a team sport. And we're going to start with how we want to be remembered. And then we're going to hand over every program that we develop more robust than we left it. And I'm just going to leave you with a quote that I love. And the quote is, "In times of change," which this is surely a time of change right now, it's the leaders who inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. I want to say thank you to the women in this room and all of you sponsors, because you're out there getting diverse points of view. You're bringing new people into the conversation. You're retraining people. And you're making sure that these women that you're retraining, these young women and girls that you're making sure are in STEM, you're ensuring that they are going to be able to operate in a future world, not the current world. And for that, I applaud you. So thank you.